good to go on the video? All right. This is an impressive crowd. I think that it's fantastic that we're all gathered here today. I think we really, really need some poetry today. The news has not been good, and I think we need to take a deep breath, and I hope we can all join together to celebrate some good things in life here. Welcome to Tabula Poetica. I'm Anna Leahy. I direct Tabula Poetica, so I curate the reading series and edit the journal tab. Please pull out your cell phone and take a moment to silence it. And if you have your Facebook or Twitter app open, you can certainly tweet or Facebook that you're here enjoying poetry today. Later this fall, Tabula Poetica will feature Genevieve Kaplan, and we'll also have a reading by our own MFA poets. In addition, there will be a special lecture in December by Presidential Fellow Carolyn Forche. Most of the support for the visiting poets and for the International Journal tab comes from the English department. I want to especially thank our department chair, Joanna Levin, who is here today. So round of applause for Joanna Levin. And I want to thank our administrative assistants, Kristen Laxo and David Krausman, and also our graduate assistant, Mike Gravagno. And David is standing in the back, and Mike is there with the purple hat on. Give them a round of applause, too. Leatherby Libraries and Fish Interfaith Center, and also Poets and Writers, continue to support our talks and readings at Tabula Poetica. Today's visiting poet has been sponsored by Richard Bausch's Special Program Building Fund, and we are incredibly grateful for his investment in the literary culture here at Chapman University and well beyond campus. And Richard is sitting here too, so go ahead and clap for Richard also. As you can tell, I'm getting over something that's going around. How many people have been sick in the last few weeks? Okay, so bear with me a little bit in terms of the throat. Richard Bausch met Ada Limón roughly a year ago, and he said to me then, right away, we really have to get this poet to Chapman, let's do it. Richard knows a lot of writers, and his enthusiasm for Ada was quick and adamant. I had read some of Ada Limón's poetry, including her most recent collection, and I agreed, let's do it. I met Ada Limón for the first time last night, and I understood why Richard had wanted to include this poet in our community here. My immediate impression was that she's a positive force in the world, that she's interested and attentive, that she's listening to everything she can pick up and offering responses that move us forward. I'm grateful that she's part of Tabula Poetica this year. Ada Limón is the author of 4 collections of poetry. The most recent is Bright Dead Things. Anyone have a copy handy? Okay, looks like that. Copies will be for sale at the reading this evening. Bright Dead Things was a National Book Award finalist, and of Bright Dead Things, Richard Blanco says, lyrical genius. Gregory Orr says, fierce jazz and sass. Nikki Finney says, a poet with the most generous of eyes. All these are descriptions of how the poetry book, this particular book, is a positive force in this world. One poem ends with the line, some sweet goodness that's so hard to take. Another ends with the line, disorderly and marvelous and ours. Another ends with, when the light finally came. Yet another concludes, and there is so much life all over the place. And the last poem in the collection ends with, say you'd still want this, us alive, right here, feeling lucky. As much ache or yearning as these poems delve into quite deeply, as much resentment of contentment as these poems share, the voice here is a positive force in this world, with musicality and texture. The marvelous is more marvelous for the disorderly. We are luckier for the want we harbor. So it is with a smile and gratitude that I welcome the hazardous bliss and unstoppable ink of Ada Limón.
Hi, everybody. How are you doing? You hanging in? It's like every day we wake up to something new and horrific on the news, right? The Mexico earthquake couldn't be enough. The Puerto Rican hurricane couldn't be enough. Florida, it's just sort of nonstop. I've been laughing about the fact that it's hard for me to go anywhere and talk with people without, like, at first doing a sort of communal grieving. Like, we all kind of have to be together and be like, okay, so how's everyone? Are you doing okay? Are you all right? And I feel like there's a checking in that needs to happen. I wasn't sort of prepared to talk about grief, but as a poet, that's sort of our language. That's what we do. And so I thought what I would do is, the original sort of goal of this talk is just to give you a little background about what it is to be a poet in the world, and how it is, how are you? To sort of surround yourself with the arts at a time when they're not always really respected and valued in our lives, in our community, in our political culture, and what that means in terms of vulnerability, and what that means in terms of the choices and decisions that you have to make for yourself in terms of self-preservation. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of a background about me, and then I'm going to lean into sort of a little bit more about being an artist. And then hopefully I will have some time for some questions afterwards. And maybe answers, or maybe I will just ask you a question back. So my name is Ada Limón, and I first began wanting to explore poetry when I was around your age. I was a junior in college. And I had written a lot before then, but never seriously. And I was a theater major. I was going to be an actor, or at least I was deciding to pursue the stage on some level. And what happened was I had taken all of the electives that I could possibly take in the drama department. And they said, you need to go to another department and take something else. And I thought, well, I want to do something where I can still be creative. So what is it? And I remembered loving poetry, and I'd written a lot of songs for bands, etc. So I was like, okay, I can do it with poetry. And I took my first class, and I thought, oh, I remember this. I love this. And then I took the intermediate, right? You had to apply to get into the intermediate class, and I took that class, and I loved it even more. And then by the end of it, I noticed that when I was on stage and performing in the plays, and where I was graduating with this theater degree, that all I was doing was primarily reading the lines of older white men. And here I was on stage trying to embody these female characters, but I didn't get a voice of my own. So I could embody them, and I could use my physicality, and I could use my voice to shift, but I didn't get the chance to speak for myself. And so suddenly, right in my senior year, I thought, oh, wow, this should have been my major. But I decided to stick it out with theater, and I love it. I love that I still do it, and I have lots of friends that, oddly, against all odds, are successful actors and doing well because of it. But so that, in my senior year, I decided that was poetry what I wanted to do. And that choice sort of shifted me forever. And I think there's a lot of studies that will tell you that decision making is actually something that can make you feel positive. When you're struggling, when you have anxiety, actually making decisions is something that gives us a direction. Even though you can pull the ripcord later and decide it was wrong, actually not waffling, but choosing something, committing to something is huge. My friend Mitchell S. Jackson, I don't know if you know his work, but he's a novelist, a young novelist, and he's working on a nonfiction book now called Survival Math. And it's all about his entire family. Mitchell is African American, and every single male member of his family has been to prison. And he talks about these decisions and the decisions that you make in those moments, and how how we choose survival. And one of the things he talks about is that when someone said, well, how come you didn't end up to be a drug dealer when you were a drug dealer at one point? And he says, I never really committed to it. I never really committed to dealing drugs. The first thing I ever committed to was being a writer. And that decision changed him forever, right? And it changed me forever. But it is a choice that decides, it shifts your life. Now, that being said, I will say, there's that famous saying, right? Do what you love and the money will follow, right? If you choose the arts, it really should be do what you love and then you should find another job and do what you love on the side. I always say that choosing poetry was a particularly interesting decision because no one gets in it for the money. No one sits down and says, oh, I'm going to write like the next $1 million poem. But we do get into it because it's what's saving us, right? It's the idea that it's what commits us over and over and over again to the world. And days like this, when it seems like life just keeps getting harder and harder and harder, that there's something that will pull you back into the world. And for us, that's poetry. For me, that's poetry. Every art form is different, but poetry in some ways I do think is that most authentic because it doesn't come with there's nothing else that, you can't even really be a famous poet, right? I was just saying that I was walking down the street with a friend of mine, Corey, one time, who's an actor, and he's really well known, and I thought someone was looking at me, and I thought, wow, my book must have gotten a lot more play than I thought. And then, of course, I noticed, and he was sort of pulling his baseball cap over his head. I thought, oh, right. Oh, right. It's the actor. That's who's actually famous. So choosing poetry brought me to New York, where I got my MFA at NYU. And in that world, suddenly discovering how expensive it was to live in a city of that size and how sort of diminished I felt as a person in a city of that size, I realized that I felt like I was leading two different lives. And there was the life that where you have to put on the mask and live and pay your rent and go to your job and do all the things that, getting through the life. And then there was the life of the writer who had to be the most vulnerable and open and easy and delving and plunging deep as you possibly can. And once I actually realized that there were the two selves, I relaxed into it a little bit more. I finally was able to be like, okay, so this is how it is. I can sort of switch it on and switch it off. And I feel like the way that I made money while I lived in New York to survive was to work for GQ magazine. I was an assistant at first. Then I left GQ and I went to Martha Stewart Living. I worked for her both in and out of prison. She was much nicer post-prison, by the way. And then I worked for Travel and Leisure magazine, went back to GQ at one point when they finally realized that I was a writer and thought, you should be the copy director. And so out of all of that sort of event work and all these different jobs I got to be the copy director at GQ. And then from there went to become the creative services director of Travel and Leisure magazine. I'm telling you this because I feel like most people who are writers and poets will tell you that there's one path and they usually lead to teaching. In my case, that wasn't the case. I worked in magazines. I also felt like I wanted to make more of a substantial living in New York so that I could pay my rent and also pay some bills and pay some of my student loans. I still have some. But in doing that, I was able to sort of enter this other world, right? Which is another world where the language was mattering. It was still being valued. That I was working for these high-end magazines, and when you talked about language and they said, well, how do we sell this magazine? Or do we have a good headline for this? I was like, yeah, this is my perfect game. This is what poets love. I get to work with words and get paid for it. It was really marvelous. And so I really loved that time in my life because I was able to sort of balance those two selves, right? I was still going home, playing music, writing poems, and being that other self, the real me. And working in the Condé Nast world and that magazine world was really fascinating for a couple reasons. And one of them, and you probably know this, is that like in those corporate jobs, only 13% of the high-level corporate jobs go to women. In magazines, it's a little bit skewed, so that women are high up there, but the publishers are all men. So it's this fascinating sort of hierarchy that happens. And for me, what happened was I got a little competitive, and I thought, well, maybe I could be the publisher, or maybe I could do this and start to, and I always laughed that I had an accidental career just out of wanting to like punch through the glass ceiling. So I worked for magazines for a long time, and in that time, which is why I was saying the whole do what you love and the money will follow, or do what you love and get another job. In that time, I loved doing those jobs. They were really fantastic for me. And I wrote 3 books of poems. And I could still do that, you know. I wrote them privately, I wrote them for myself, and then published them. And you know, my first book came out, and which was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And I will tell you that prior to that experience I was at a bar and someone said, "What do you do?" And I said, I didn't say I worked in magazines. I said, "I'm a poet." And he said, "Oh, do you have a book out?" And I thought, you know, I didn't. But it's really one of the few times in my life that I just wanted it so badly I lied. And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Oh, what's it called? I'll get it." And I was like, "Oh, then my friends are leaving. I gotta go." And I ran out immediately because I was terrified. But it felt so good to say it that I thought that's how I knew that's what I really, really wanted. I wanted that book in the world. I wanted to be able to hand it to somebody and say, "This is what I do." And that happened for me, luckily enough, in 2005 with my first book, Lucky Wreck. And in case you think it was super glamorous, I was working for Martha Stewart, and she had just come out of prison, and her security guards were with her because she wasn't supposed to be attending a board conference, and yet she was. And she was wearing her ankle bracelet. And these 2 policemen were there, and I was hiding in the kitchen while all this was happening, opening my first book because I'd brought it in my bag and thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to look at the cover, I'm going to explore it. This is amazing. But at the same time, I still kind of had to hide it and go about and do my other job, right? Which was complicated and fun. So then 6 months later, after my first book came out, my second book got picked up. So I had 2 manuscripts that were out circulating, and nothing had happened, and then it was bam, bam. So I went from having nothing to having 2 books out immediately. And I had just turned 30. And someone once said, "So how did it change your life?" And I always said, well, I broke up with my boyfriend immediately and lost 10 pounds. But that was other than that, you know, having your first book of poems out just feels good, but it doesn't necessarily change your life. I did all my own tours, put together the little road trips that one does to sell your poems out of the back seat of the car, and really, you know, realized for a long time that I had to compartmentalize it because it wasn't going to make me a living, and I was okay with that, and I made my living another way. Then in 2010, my third book came out called Sharks in the Rivers. And at that point, I had really been itching to get out of New York and trying to align myself more with my creativity, right? More with my poetry side. Those 2 selves were starting to battle a little too much. And I kept feeling like the mask I had to put on, the uniform that I had to put on, was getting just too uncomfortable. And I wanted to be in a place where I was either writing full time or I was writing most of the time, or something was happening where I was aligning, and so that when I said I was a poet, people didn't look at me like I was nuts, which happens sometimes in the magazine world, right? Or it happens in the world in general. And so in 2010, I saved up a little money and gave my notice and quit my job, and decided that in order to, and Richard's going to laugh at this, in order to make a living, or in order to, like, you know, I had this great idea for a novel. So I thought, well, poetry, I can't make a living in poetry, so I'll write a novel. And I did. I wrote a novel. It's about 360 pages long. It's terrible. And in the meantime, while I was writing that novel, I was writing poems for myself. Poems that were probably the most open and most who I am. But because I wasn't focusing on them in a way that felt like I was going to publish them, or I was really working on the novel, and also I was spending so much time with these other characters, right? With novel fiction, you've got this whole creative world that's in your head. So then when I went to poetry, all I could do was talk about myself. And in a way, that book became a whole new way of speaking, because I was being my most tender on the page, my most vulnerable, my most shame-free, if you will, because I wasn't performing in any way. I wasn't, Victoria and I talked about this, I wasn't trying to pretend to be smart. I think that for a long time, and especially this happens in the creative fields as women sometimes, with all of us, but I know as a woman that you really get concerned that people aren't going to take you seriously if you aren't smart enough. And there's a level that you think, how do I make my art smart, right? Well, one of the ways we do it, especially if you're women, is we take out all the emotion. If we take out the emotion, my art will be smarter. If I take out the I, if it's not about me, then it'll definitely be smarter, right? And you start taking out all these parts of it so that no one can tell that A, it's a woman, or B, it's emotional. You won't be accused of being sentimental. All of these things you can kind of wring out of it. And then what happens is what you have left is something that's kind of innocuous, right? It's a brick of words. And so for me, when I started working on this novel, what happened was this byproduct became my fourth book, which was Bright Dead Things. And this book when I got it, and I will tell you, I had a panic attack when I got it. Because I got it in the mail, and I thought, oh my God, I just told everybody my secrets. I literally just felt like I had written a diary. Now, here's the thing. I crafted them. I know it's full of music. I worked my ass off on these poems. I know they are solid poems. I'm not saying I was like ashamed of them in any way. It just was, they were so personal. And you could read it and be like, oh, I know you now, right? There's a level of intimacy. And I had not had that yet. My books before that, yes, there was me, but there was distance. This was the first where the distance was gone. I sat in I still haven't had coffee since this day. I had coffee before I got my box of books delivered. The UPS man dropped it off at my door, and I said, can you bring it on the table, because it was so heavy. And I sat there and I opened them, and I really, I full on, I was like, do I need to go to the hospital? Am I having a heart attack? And then I remembered a friend had said, no, this is a panic attack. So I opened this book, and I couldn't read it. I couldn't read it at all. And then I called my friend Jennifer Knox, who's another writer, and I said, okay, the only thing that I have going for me right now is that nobody will read it. Because it's a book of poems. So, Bob Hickok has that great thing. What is that saying? If you want to keep a secret, put it in a book. If you want to keep a secret, write a poem about it, because no one will read it. But then, suddenly, it started getting reviewed. It started getting picked up by the New York Times. Its pub date was 15 days later after I got it. Its pub date was September 15th of 2015. On that day, it got longlisted for the National Book Award. So suddenly the book that I was like, it's okay, no one's gonna read it. I'll go work on the novel again, or another something that I can hide myself in. And I was freaking out, for real. I was like, this is not what I expected. I didn't expect to be as vulnerable in a public way. And then it got shortlisted for the National Book Award, which means I was in the top 5 of the books that year. And now everybody was reading it. And then after that, I was like, well, at least I didn't win the National Book Award, right? Because then we can settle down, no big deal. And then it got nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And I remember telling my friend, I had tears, and I was like, I don't think I can handle being nominated for anything else anymore, because it was really stressful. because you have to go to these readings, you have to get really dressed up. I brought my entire family to the National Book Awards. Like really, the Limons represent. I mean, everyone's like, well, your table's good looking. I was like, yeah, that's the Limons. That's my father, that's my stepfather, that's my mother. It was like the first time my father and my mother had been in the same room since my brother's wedding. And it was a massive, like it was just such a good party. And, you know, of course, didn't win. Or actually, I could just say I did. Who knows? No, I didn't win. And flew off to Miami the next day to keep reading, to keep promoting this book, to do all these things that people were suddenly like, oh, we want you to read this book. And I would get up there and think, okay, now here's the thing. I left this other job, right, because I had these two selves. And I wanted to have one self. But really, the performing self and the writing self are still two selves. Because the person that's up here and talking to you about this is not the person who I am when I write the poems. Because the person I am when I write the poems is the most vulnerable person. Like that's the person when you play music or where you really do feel so essentially yourself. And that's different than the person that has to be in front of people, right? Even if that person is like just getting coffee or going to the grocery store. So I feel like there's a level where I'm never going to align those two selves, and I really have to feel comfortable with that. But I am aligning my passions, right? Because talking to you about poetry is so much more fun than talking to a room full of marketing folks about how best we're going to market travel and leisure for the well-heeled business traveler, right? So I still working on aligning those selves. But I do think this idea of being tender to the world and having those two selves as creative people in the world, it's really, really intense. There's this great acting coach, he's super dramatic, in New York. And he used to tell us, William Esper is his name. And he used to tell his acting students, he said, being an artist, being an actor is like walking around without a first layer of skin. Even the wind burns. And I used to laugh. I was like, eh. But at the same time, I think there's something to be said for being an artist. There is that level of like, everything hurts. Everything touches you. And things touch you in ways that they don't touch other people, right? Because other people have a little bit more barrier. We have to break down that barrier in order to write. So we sort of do this thing where we build the barrier to go outside, and then we take down the barrier to go write, and we build the barrier. And the thing is that we're often doing this all the time. Like you might be sitting here and think, I'm not a writer, but I do this every day, right? Because a lot of what we do is the same thing if we do if like we're a person of color, right? We leave, or you leave if you get to be in a space that's all the people, like if you're with all of your brown and black friends, and then you're in another space, like we put on a different level. There's a different engagement that happens. And so I feel like there's that masking that we have to be aware of. But I do think on some level, William Esper, even with all of his drama, you know, even the wind burns sometimes. And when these things happen in our country and in the world, and we do have a sense of communal grief, and that idea that we're going to try to somehow go through the day, right? I think about this all the time. People say, oh, well, you know, if you put something on Facebook, I find this interesting. You put something on Facebook and you say, I'm really grieving for this. And someone will say, well, what about this? Right? You'll say, my heart with Mexico. And then they'll say, what about Puerto Rico? Or they'll say, I'm sad about this. And they'll be like, what about Cecil the lion? Or, there's an interesting, fantastic sort of thing that happens where everyone's trying to grab onto the grief or tell you what you should do or tell you how you should grieve. And what I've found that is so interesting to me is that the human capacity to grieve many different things at once is fascinating and beautiful. And we all have that in us, that we're able to actually handle all of these things. The fact that most of us have lost a friend or have lost a parent or will lose a parent and have to go through and after this extraordinary grieving process, then have to go and like brush our teeth, drop the kids off, do whatever we do to like go through life, right? We have to do it. That's what we do. But how strange is it that we are juggling all those things at once, but we are, right? And being an artist in the world is still trying to juggle those things all at once. And I always say that the most successful pieces of art that I have ever seen are ones that have that capacity for all of those things, so that the characters have all that capacity, so that the poem is as complicated as a human being. And there's a level to it that we're sort of working against, that we know that it's round and full, and that we can actually hold both grief and hope, delusionment and despair all at once. And that it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think that that's, where the artist often stands, is in a place where we are negotiating all of those emotions at once. Right? There's like 600 human emotions, 6,000 human emotions, 6,000. Most people like really only exhibit 12. So we have this level where we're like, where do we go to have this depth? And I think part of it is just to be aware that we have the capacity for it, that it isn't just one or the other. And sometimes, right, when we're presenting ourselves on the social media or whatever, we have this idea that you have to have this one thing, like, right, we have to have one passion, or we have to have one thing, or one, and you don't. I think there's a level to being an artist that I always think poets are the best hustlers, that we know how to do many, many different things. And it's primarily because we can't make a living at our one full thing. So, poets often have different jobs. I know a guy who shoes horses for a living. I know a guy who works on cars for a living, and they're both incredible poets. I know a guy who's a line cook. These are like, this is what we do. And so I think that level to be, that we always have an idea perhaps that to be an artist or to be a success, in quotes, we have to sort of have this one thing that we excel at and everybody is aware of. But in reality, creating art, the act of creation, that's the success. The fact that I made anything in the first place is what makes me a success. Not that anyone read it, not that I won anything. Sorry, didn't win anything, but got nominated for things. Though that's not any part of that world. It's the part of the world that's actually the creation of it. I want to read a poem to you. And Michael, you heard this before, but I feel like just because we're talking about just where we are in today's news, and this was written in 2016, and you can kind of hear, well, you can't just kind of hear. I could have written it today. I could have written it this morning. And then I'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll maybe think about some questions you might want to ask me. The Leash. After the birthing of bombs, of forks and fear, the frantic automatic weapons unleashed, the spray of bullets into a crowd holding hands, the brute sky opening in a slate metal maw that swallows only the unsayable in each of us, what's left? Even the hidden nowhere river is poisoned orange and acidic by a coal mine. How can you not fear humanity? Want to lick the creek bottom dry to suck the deadly water up into your own lungs like venom. Reader, I want to say, don't die. Even when silvery fish after fish comes back belly up and the country plummets into a crepitating crater of hatred, isn't there still something singing? The truth is, I don't know. But sometimes I swear I hear it, the wound closing like a rusted over garage door, and I can still move my living limbs in the world without too much pain, can still marvel at how the dog runs straight toward the pickup trucks, breaknecking down the road because she thinks she loves them. She's sure without a doubt that the loud roaring things will love her back. Her soft, small self alive with desire to share her goddamn enthusiasm. Until I yank the leash back to save her because I want her to survive forever. Don't die, I say. And we decide to walk for a bit longer, starlings high and fevered above us, winter coming to lay her cold corpse down upon this little plot of earth. Perhaps we are always hurtling our body towards the thing that will obliterate us, begging for love from the speeding passage of time. And so maybe, like the dog obedient at my heels, we can walk together peacefully, at least until the next truck comes. Thank you. It was strange I had this on my pile to perhaps read tonight. And then I thought, after everything that happened this morning, someone had posted it and said, oh, you should read this. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll read it today at the talk. I want to talk a little bit about the construction of grief and translating that into artwork. And I will say that primarily in my life, what I do is try to pull myself out of despair. That's what my art is for, so that I can feel better. And I think that there are some people that believe that I write so that you can feel better, which is great. I would love for you guys to feel better after something I read. That would be an amazing gift. But I also think that it would be extreme hubris on my part to believe that anything I could write could make you feel better. All I know is that I can begin by trying to make myself feel better. When I translate grief into work, oftentimes I do it right in the moment. People will ask me if I wait, right? If it has to be after something happens. Like I wrote a lot of poems about my stepmom who passed away, and someone said, did you do that? Did it take you years to write it? And it's no. I wrote it, within hours sometimes, within weeks of her passing. But I will tell you why. Every study that has ever been created about writing through trauma is that it helps. It heals. It helps. So it seems silly to me that if someone would walk into an operation room or to an emergency room, with a wound, that we wouldn't say, oh, I know how to fix it. I know how to wrap it. And writing about grief actually helps you process the grief. Even if it's, just a journal entry or but it's in that work that actually does something to the brain that adjusts us so that we can kind of live again. And I will say that in my opinion, I think it's because it's that act of creating is recommitting to the world over and over again. It's just recommitting to being in it. Because the act of creating is saying, I want to be around long enough so that I can create something else, right? And that part of being a poet is the thing that I think maybe I take the most sincerely or the most seriously, is that I want to make sure that whatever I'm creating is authentic to myself. And if it then translates to you or to a wider audience, then it's a huge blessing, but it has nothing to do with what my first impetus is, right? The first thing that I want to do is to create something that I can hear and can sing within me and can feel complete within me and help me recommit to the world. If it does that for you, that's just a big, big bonus. I want to say just a few things about where I am now, since you heard a little bit about my early life, which is just that since this book has come out, I have been able to write more full-time in a way that has aligned with those two selves, that I'm able to spend more time with the sensitive, sobbing self that writes the poems. And that I've also been able to explore one of the scariest subjects for me, which is joy. Because I think that it's really, really difficult to write joyful poems. I always say, it seems like oftentimes we sit down to write a poem. If you ask anyone, write a poem, the first thing they say is, okay, what's the worst thing that ever happened to me? I'm like, why is that where you go if I just ask you to write a poem? But I think this permission to have joy or to have happiness in our life or to have just contentedness or fulfillment and to talk about that, there's something really scary about that. And I think partly is because I think as soon as we admit to being even slightly happy, we expect the bus to come, right? And knock us over, take us out. Because it feels super, super scary to admit that we have something, that we're happy, that we're contented. And And so writing about that has been a real gift, to actually be like, okay, what is it to celebrate life? What is it to be grateful, to have immense gratitude, especially at a time when it seems nearly impossible to do so. So the book has given me permission to do that. I just now have finished my my 5th book, which should be coming out next year. And it's the first time, I will tell you, that I've ever actually sold a book. Most of the time people will say, okay, I'm so glad to publish the book. Here's a little small amount of money, and which is fantastic. And as poets, we get really grateful for that. We're like, they want to publish it. That's awesome. This was the first shift where it actually, I might actually be able to buy a car with the money, which is, I don't know if I will. I'll probably just put it in savings. But that kind of level as poets is like, it's not something that we usually get. And so it's a nice sort of grateful thing that happens. And having worked at this for a long time and worked in a way that has been hopefully true to the art form, it's been nice to know that the next book will be, I'll get my first hardcover, which I've never had. I'll get my first audiobook, which I've never had. So that's exciting to have that world open a little bit more for me. And again, it's still not exactly how I make my living. I still write for magazines. I write for GQ. I write for Travel and Leisure. I write for them all the time. I don't write for Martha. I never turned into the, I do make a good ham, but that was about it. But so I think the journey has been very fascinating, and I hope me sort of sharing that with you gives you an idea of sort of the many different ways to come at an art form, and the way that it doesn't always have to go right into teaching or right into one position or another, and that it's also not about success, right? I mean, most of it is about the creation. The making of the thing is the best part of all of this, and it's a real gift for me. So I had this thinking of poems. We were talking about quotes earlier, like the things that circle in your head. And as you probably know this as songs, right? You have like a lyric that gets stuck in your head, or a tune that gets stuck in your head. As poets, we get lines stuck in our head. And I was thinking about the poem by Robert Haas, Faint Music. And the first line is, maybe you should write a poem about grace, which I love, because it's like this instruction to himself, right? It's so hard to do, but maybe you should write a poem about grace. And it goes on, because, when everything is broken and everything dead is dead, and the hero has looked into the mirror, and it's just marvelous. It goes on and on. I can recite the whole thing. But the last line of this whole poem is, let me see if I can get it right. I had the idea that the world's so full of pain that it must make some kind of singing, and that the sequence helps as much as the order. First the pain, then the ego, then the singing, which I love. Anyway, thank you guys so much. I think I have some time for questions.
Yep, a few more minutes for questions. And we'll open it up to the audience.
I just stunned you all to silence. Yeah. I've solved all your problems, or created many more. And I will answer anything about anything. Yeah?
First of all, thank you so much. That was incredible.
Oh, thank you.
As someone who plays music and also works a lot, I definitely understand what you may have like you found the mask, and for a while it seems fine, but they definitely start conflicting.
Mm-hmm.
For you, what was your process of, number one, defining the moment that happened, that became too much, and then going forward and focusing more on the art form, which is what you truly wanted to do, and making money in that?
Yeah. I had a moment where I was flying to Las Vegas, actually, to work at there's a hotel, it's not new anymore, but it's called the Aria. I don't know if you know it, but it was launching. So I was working on the campaign launch. And they were flying me out there, and it was like, we were at this, like, it's all fancy, it's beautiful dinner. And I looked around and I thought, this would be a really great job for somebody who wanted it. And I kept thinking, I'm taking someone else's place. Like, someone who really wants this job should be here. Like, this is awesome. I feel nothing inside. I really didn't. Like, I was like, they were showing me, here's this beautiful Dale Chihuly, 10,000 glass structure in the middle of it. And I kept thinking, oh, okay. Like, I just was like, I would want it to be alone, and I wanted to be writing. And it was so hard for me after that realization to kind of, and then when we had downtime, my wonderful colleagues who I adore would shop. And I stopped buying anything, and I realized I was putting every single thing that I could away so that I could sort of make my exit. And I made that shift. And it was intense because, how do you give up a really good job that people think you're crazy to do that? And I had worked at it, and I had worked really hard to get there. So suddenly I was like, well, I'm just giving this thing up. But then when I really started realizing that shift had to happen, I started visualizing what it would look like. And I actually wrote a song. I listened to the song the other day. I'm a terrible guitar player, but I am okay at lyrics. And I had written this song that basically was visualizing my life in the Sonoma Valley, where I'm from, back on this mountain. And I had this whole thing, and that's what the song was about. And one of the lines is, I'm going to, hey ma, I'm going to run away. I'm going to drive my car over the Golden Gate. I'm going to put my heart back in its golden state. And I had that in my head. I'm going to put my heart back in its golden state. And that, to me, I called my friends up who own that mountain. I always say it's always nice to have friends with property if you want to be an artist. And I said, I know you offered me this little apartment, this little mother-in-law apartment on the property. I need to write a book. Can I come there and live for a while? They said, sure. I told my dad, hey, I know that you're going to hate me, you're going to be really mad at me, but I have to quit this job, which you don't do if you're a Limon. You don't quit a job. And he said, okay. And he said, why don't I give you a car? It has 200,000 miles on it. And, it's barely running, but it'll be in California. He drove it down from Washington State to California and left it there for me. And I had a plan. Suddenly I had a car, I had a little tiny apartment, and I had a little bit of savings, and I took that risk. And I still remember driving that car up the mountain. It was barely making it because it was a pretty old car. I still have it. And driving up the mountain, and I just started crying because I thought, oh my God, I get to be me. I got out of there. And I love New York. I was there for 12 years. It's a beautiful city. All my friends are still there. But my whole body changed. I felt like every cell in my body shifted when I got back. Yeah.
How much that really means to me,
Oh.
my position, how much that relates to me. That's wonderful.
Thank you for the question. Yeah.
I have a question, because you're saying that you felt kind of embarrassed when people actually started reading your work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how you approach when you write something really personal, sharing it with people who are really close to you. Because I know for me, that when I write something that may be a bit personal, I feel like I would be okay with people I don't know reading it, but people I do know, I would feel a little bit invaded,
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. I will say that it's still hard. I mean, my father and I are very close, and he's going to pick me up tomorrow morning. And originally he was going to come to the reading, and I got excited, and then I got terrified. And I was like, oh, there's lots of things I haven't talked to him about yet, and I was going to read some poems about that. And it's just a matter of having that discussion beforehand. I will say that it is very hard. And I think that one of the things that I often say is that if you have a relationship that needs to be broken open, and you feel like maybe the thing you write might be able to do that, and you are willing to have those conversations, then you can share away. But if you aren't there yet, and you actually can't have that conversation yet, or it's going to damage something irrevocably, then don't do it. Write it, but put it in a drawer, or write it and burn it, But I feel like there is that. I mean, the people in our lives are what we have, right? We're seeing this today. The people, we don't want to lose anyone. So if you can't, write it and keep them. Choose the person you love, you know. If it's bigger than that and it's going to open something, you know, or if it's someone you need to not have a relationship with anymore, that's a different story. But yeah, no, it's real, and we have to be accountable for it. You know, one of the things we can't do is be like, oh no, it's just a poem. When they're like, no, it's everything I just talked to you about. It's not a poem. That's our lives, honey. Right? Yeah. So we do have to be accountable for it. We have to own it. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Well, I'm a computer science major,
Mhm.
but my real passion is photography.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, I was just wondering your advice on balancing like what's like conflicting things.
Yeah, I mean here's the thing I love about photography is it's simple. It's similar to writing. One of the reasons that I stopped acting was that you require other people to do it. Someone gets to tell you when to do it. You know, they hire you. Someone then gets to direct you. Someone then tells you what you're speaking, and then you have to have an audience. I mean, there's so many components to that. And I love an art form where I could go to the bathroom right now and write a poem or a line of poem, right? That's, to me, it's awesome. Photography is the same way. You can do it, you know, just with some good equipment and your eye. You know, if you have that vision, you can do it. So for me, balance the two as long as you can, as long as you like the other thing. I mean, computer sciences, I feel like actually kind of works in tandem with that because you could create all of your own websites. You could even use that as design. I mean, there's a lot to be said for those two worlds colliding. And they can collide for a little while as long as you want them to. You know, but to me, it's like you can always stoke the art form as much as you can, you know, and as much as you spend all your time doing it, and still make a living. You know, I always say your art form does not want you to be hungry. It doesn't want you to be without rent. It doesn't want you to be worried. You know what the worst, like most silencing thing for an art form is anxiety. And if we're stressed out about everything else, you know, it's hard to create, which is why it's better to have a 9-to-5 desk job answering phones and be writing poems being like, I get health insurance for this. You know, you can balance it. You can. Yeah.
Sorry, this is kind of a convoluted question. You just brought up some
I'll just give you a convoluted answer. So,
issues. Okay, so we're talking about these two personae, and it seems like for you as a poet, you know, I was really struck by being creative, and I absolutely agree being an authentic self in poetry and art, allowing oneself to do that.
mm-hmm.
So, and that contrasting with your public self where you have to put up those barriers. So I think that's all very, very true. So I was wondering, in your case,
Mm-hmm.
that release valve kind of happened for you because you became a poet,
Mm-hmm.
a recognized, talented poet,
Mm-hmm.
right? So for those of us who don't plan on becoming or can't become recognized
Mhm.
poets,
Mm-hmm.
how would you suggest that some of the lessons of being an authentic, being true to yourself, might be able to bleed out or help us in other aspects of our lives in a way that is not, I mean, Audre Lorde said silence cannot protect you, but the problem is that sometimes poetry and art,
Mm-hmm.
to be good, you have to be truthful.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be authentic. But in the world, that isn't always true. And being truthful can get you fired,
Mm-hmm.
get you murdered,
Mm-hmm.
get you, right? So how does one take the lessons that
Mm-hmm.
I would love to be able to embody
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
outside of poetry?
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's possible, but it's also, I mean, it's a balancing act, right? Like there's a level of what you're talking about, like a self-preservation that has to occur, right? Your safety has to be of importance. Like if you're at a place, I mean, there are people that have put art into the world that have then spent so much time battling with their family because they didn't get things approved with their memoir. Or there's just the person that wrote that wonderful book about the Holocaust deniers. You know, there's people who actually don't believe that the Holocaust happened. And she wrote this amazing book talking about them, right? What is this movement? What's it coming from? Why does it exist? It's a nonfiction book. She didn't think anything would happen. One of the people that she calls out in the book sued her. It was 6 years she spent, and her own money, defending the fact. So what he basically, and the fact is, if she didn't defend herself, he could have said basically that his was a fact, that the Holocaust could have, it was just one viewpoint, right? So she had to do it because she had to, but there is that level of like, yes, the truth can be really scary, and there's a time where it can actually be dangerous. But I do think that we do have to speak out. We do have to speak out, and I think sometimes what happens is we need that community. We maybe need to do it within our safe spaces first, and that's where we start before we take it bigger, right? We need to have that discussion within our safe spaces so that we're able to like maybe talk about some truths that are harder and realer before we're able to write them down even, or before we're able to share them with a wider public. Because I think sometimes that's where it needs, we need to get some more permission and some more strength behind us so that we're not alone. Did that answer? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I have one sort of follow-up question in terms of being authentic. You talked about the pressure to seem smart.
Mm.
And I'm wondering whether you feel as if that was almost entirely internal pressure, or whether there was pressure from others, and whether your mentors or your peers in poetry classes were also encouraging you to do things that made you seem smart. And then how exactly you got over that and moved toward the more authentic, or
Right.
the ability to say the truth.
Well,
if there were contradictions.
I think so. So I think pressure comes in different ways, right? Like pressure comes from someone saying, yes, this is, how maybe you should write in workshop, right? Or someone saying an offhand comment that, oh, your poems are also heartfelt, right? Or they're also sensitive, or you always write about the heart, or you whatever it is, like there's some sort of way that it doesn't seem demeaning to anyone else, but you walk away knowing exactly, like, right? Like people will say, like if someone asks you about what did you think of Ada's poems, and you say, she really commands a crowd, right? Or I was just up at Cincinnati, and one of the professors there, an older gentleman, I had just read for a half an hour reading, and he came off, and I was with Rebecca Lindenberg, who teaches there, and she said, wasn't she amazing? And he said, she has a beautiful smile. And I was like, okay, so these are the ways that, right? So it's not about saying, no one's saying be smart, but I take all of those and internalize them. And then you look at, see what's being published, right? And at the time, I think there was a lot of poems that you had either two things. One was the poem that was confessional without any music. So it was just saying all the things. It was just speaking truth, but it had no music. It wasn't interesting to the ear. And then you had poems that, honestly, I still couldn't tell you what they meant. But they sounded kind of cool, but maybe they were like objects. Like I'd still be like, I don't know. And those were the two things that were being published. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to be smart, right? So if I want to be smart, I have to look like this lyric opaqueness. And whereas like the other one, I was so scared to go into the confessional zone because of so much backlash that had happened. And I don't think it was, I think I internalized it, but I don't think the pressure was coming from myself. I think the pressure was coming from outside. I think it's still up from outside. I think that, especially as a woman, I will tell you, we were having this discussion today about like, I don't write about motherhood because I'm not a mother, But I think that my friends who have children as poets, they don't want to do it because they get immediately categorized as like a mother poet, or like she's writing a lot of mother poems, or there's some sort of thing that happens that dismisses. Whereas if a guy, and this is true, I've been in the room where this has happened, writes like a one poem about like changing his son, and the whole audience is like, oh my God, that's so courageous and brave. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, he's just like being a dad. But there's a certain amount of like level that gives a little more credit. And I think, if you like, I had that a little bit of that competitive spirit, and to compete with the big boys, I think I was like, okay, I'm just going to be smart, right? I'm not going to be tender. I'm not going to be sentimental. But the truth is, as a human being, a living human being in the world, I am tender and I am sentimental and I am open-hearted, and that's who I am. And I don't want to hide it under a mask of false intelligence based on someone else's opinion on what is popular.
I think one last question, and then we'll wrap it up and have informal conversation. We have the room until about 3:45.
Have you ever experienced a writing block, or do you have any work that you never got to or finish?
Yeah, well, I wrote that novel that I threw away. Then I wrote a second novel just recently, and I threw that away. I've written two novels. No, I should say I've written 2 word processing documents that were long and had many pages. But writer's block, to me, I don't know. I have a weird sort of relationship with it. I think that poets are different with writer's block than fiction and nonfiction writers, and partly it's because no one's waiting for us to finish anything. So if we want to take our time, we can. So when I'm not writing, it feels okay to me. I call it the gathering time. And what I do is I just take notes all the time. So if something's interesting, something hits me. I have a phone full of notes. I have both of these things. I have this notepad and my phone, and I'm constant. I almost held up the phone like you didn't know what it was, and a phone. But in that sort of sense, I'm constantly taking notes, and then when I get that moment and something is like hitting me to where I cannot keep it down anymore, then I have all of that great material that I can return to sort of help the poem flourish. Yeah. So for me, the note-taking helps a ton.
All right, very quickly, 2 more
I
questions.
just want to add to the help. Someone asked me exactly about the reading. You're not as smiling about any of the personal
Yeah. I always love that.
And Mildred, you get the last question.
As you were saying about your job, you worked in your company,
Uh-huh.
of course you should always have a side job if you're really into that specific art. I always liked reading, and although I wrote a few times, but I like reading more. Like I really read out loud, I get into the characters, even poetry, I can always visualize it. So that was always my strong suit. So that's why I chose to teach. And taking classes on how to be a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
so on and so forth. It really speaks to me. So my question is, like, for somebody as myself, even though we're not so strong with the pen, but we like to vocalize
Mm-hmm.
our opinions or thoughts. I got a lot of criticism about wanting to become a teacher. A person with my family, some no-no. Yet they would say find another job. So I thought that was really interesting because I never seen, I knew about journalism, I knew about different kinds of magazines and so on, but I never thought of it as something that I can get up on a platform and explain something to
Mhm.
somebody,
Mhm.
instead that I love, or, some people can benefit something.
Mm-hmm.
What's your intake about how to have a platform because they're good at speaking out and helping others, but they cannot necessarily
Yeah, I think that my friend always says that if you like presenting and you like sharing a life story with someone, pick 3 or 4 stories and learn to tell them really well. I mean, and then like people will eventually, if that story is really interesting, like my friend Mitchell S. Jackson, like his book Survival Math came out of basically like him telling a story about his life, and now he's writing a fantastic nonfiction book. Well, it's done, and it'll be out in August. But I think a lot of it is just like choosing your stories and choosing the ones that matter and seeing what might relate to somebody else. Yeah.
Okay, we do have to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank
Ada
you.
Limón.
Thank you.
And just thank you all for coming to hang out and talk poetry with us this afternoon. If you want to hear more of the poems, 7 p.m. in the Center for American War Letters in the basement of Leatherby Libraries, and there will be refreshments, and the library is hosting, and they usually do a pretty good job with the refreshments.
Come for the refreshments. Stay for the poetry.
So Wednesday's 101, folks. If you didn't sign in, if you could do that. Really, Cole?
No, I saw you and Vaughn.
I couldn't tell.
You had a question. We didn't get to it. Which one? Okay.
But it's just like, I already have the type degree.
So kind of like a rough draft or like a rough draft or a rough draft.
Yeah. Thank you. I was just curious. Thank you so much.
As we said, the hearing, it depends what poem you're writing about, that what you, some poems are long enough and ask, there's so many moments to interpret it. You could spend your whole life interpreting. Victoria seem to be connected to it. And
Briefly, as she was out at the end.
any other questions about the biology?
So we wanted to
She was gonna read it at the last
I got you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Have a great day.
we wanted to just go off more off of the 2 poems.
Yes, I just want to say hello.
But you all know each other now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Who's thinking
Okay.
after the
So it
reading?
doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I
that.
think
So one day, recently, you were at all of them to write on airplanes.
Well, I'm gonna go help her out.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's what I.
she's not.
I was walking to campus and we had exchanged Facebook messages.
Okay.
This is more, this is stage 2. Now you're moving to
Alrighty, I'll see you
Yeah,
later.
it's,
Okay.
I appreciate your effort, but you've got to answer them soon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
If you, I read through the book, and, yeah, I'm really interested in poems like animals, the human animal. Then you look at one or more of those poems and delve into it. Here's the one poem, like this end. Again, if you bear down and look at a few of the essays in the whole book, right? There's a 5 paragraphs or 8 paragraphs. She goes through and she addresses some things, not everything. And that's sort of what you want to talk about. No, punctuation. Sound. And then like Or just look up more work by a poet. This is, you've got to do some of this yourself.
Yeah.
You've got to like, what would I do in order to know more or learn more? And you want to pick an essay that will inspire you, that learns more about the poem, about the poet, about so give it a try.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
You're like, I'm trying to do the next time. Oh, thank you.
We're going off. Really, I'm really impressed. Yeah. Great question.
Around the corner, some chaser, cold ball, put that together. If you look at most of these poems, they're just like, it's just like imprinted and claw marks, rips.
What do you want to do for
I know.
What would you like to do?
do you want to go back upstairs?
Sure, whatever. Okay.
There's also, if you're free, there's
It'd be really cute. If I was. Although, are we?
right, everything early, which is really at 2 o'clock for you.
If I don't see you tonight.
No, it's at 8 o'clock for me. Oh, right.
All the way around.
If I don't see you
I'm
tonight.
in California.
Are you not coming?
I'm gonna try.
I love everything on this site.
I actually, I do Sister Cities.
Oh, yeah, I
do
did.
that
I went to Kanye.
Oh, okay, so I do that for my hometown. Our board meeting at 5:30. So I'm gonna try to
Who's
make
your
it
sister city?
We have 3. We
Okay.
have Fukui, Japan, Morale, Mexico, and Yongan, Korea.
Oh, wow.
We just started Mexico trip.
Great.
You can take a card now. 6 signatures. But, so we just had this big trip and we're trying to like debrief because of how do we, share the successes of this. That's why I couldn't make it 6:30. Rush down. So if I don't, thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, it's really lovely to meet you. I do that stuff all the time. I'm always like, well, I'm just waiting for the other hat to drop. And they're just like, what? What are you talking about? But I get it, the roll up.
And I get that. Like, I understand it. Like, it doesn't have to go.
I was like, it was so quiet. You would, a needle would fall and he was like, just stop. He was like, no. Stop talking. Yeah, exactly. Oh, yay! You know, I hadn't seen it in person. I didn't know you were coming here to Chapman, and we were just, my husband went and found a book, and this was just.
I was gonna say, the very next day after we saw your poem and stuff, I went to the library at Amsterdam and 81st, and they had Sharks in the River, and I read as much of it as I could. I don't live in New York, couldn't check the book out. And then the next day, we went to see a reading. It was actually of Josh Green's book.
Oh, yeah.
The man and the deal with the devil.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, which was a worthy event, but after, I was like, come on, we're gonna go look for Ada's book. And she's like, she needed to get back because her cat had been sick.
Oh.
at least checked the poetry section, and they didn't have it.
That's right. But this was, we had no idea you were coming to Chapman, and this was just totally on the basis of the subway.
So the subway poem is going to be in the new book. They sent me, I think actually, so they sent me the subway poem. I asked, I said, this might be a really cheesy question, but can I have one of them? Like, will you send me the poster?
The poster's beautiful.
So they sent it to me, and they sent me the really, really long one. And then they sent me this, which I might be the most exciting thing for some reason. It's on the back of the Metro card. Total New Yorker, right? Like, he's still valid. Right. We just put it on the back of the card.
In the Market Square, they have poems. I mean, they have,
I also want to ask you considering this poem. Are there any other animals in there? Did you just come out with those 4 animals?
That was what was in there for me. Yeah. I was surprised they took that poem. I was happy with it, but I also think it was short enough.
No, but while you were composing the poem, those animals
were the ones
just
that
came
came
out
out.
in that order.
I don't know why. Those were them. Yeah, I didn't revise them. Those were them.
Cool. It's a good day.
Yes, I'm so glad. I'm excited. I'm going back to New York October 24th and 25th for they're having a weekend center reading for all those poets that are on the subways at the buses. Right? Yeah. So I'm excited.
Who else was we? I think
There's Major Jackson and Bill Collins and Tracy Smith and I don't remember who's all the names. It's going to be next group. Yes. Of course, I love him. I don't know if he's going to be there though. And I think I saw his name. I think he's in there, but I don't think his name was on the list of people who come to read. But who knows? New York. I could show up and the list could be like it's a person, 300 person reading or something. I hope that was being happy. Oh, I hope that was good.
no students would love for that class.
Well, you never know about it. You're like, what are they?
It's hard to read observation questions too. Like when you're out there,
It was funny because for a while they were so stoned, but then they just loosened up all of a sudden. I was like, what just happened? You guys don't do a shot of tequila?